A 6-year-old boy sat on the golden throne of Egypt, watching his first execution with the cold curiosity of a child dissecting an insect. But this wasn't just any child. This was Pepi II, who would rule for 94 years and transform from an innocent boy into history's most depraved monster. By the time death finally claimed him, he had personally ordered the torture and execution of over 50,000 people, invented methods of suffering so horrific that even hardened executioners refused to carry them out, and driven the greatest civilization on earth into complete collapse. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt, because the Pharaoh, who ruled longer than any human in history, used every single one of those years to perfect the art of human suffering. The year was 2278 BC, and Egypt stood at the absolute peak of its power. The Great Pyramids had already stood for centuries as testament to Egyptian might. The Nile floods were predictable and bountiful, and trade routes stretched from Nubia to the Mediterranean. Into this golden age was born a prince named Pepi Neferkare, whose very name meant, "Beautiful is the soul of Ra." It was a name that would become history's cruelest irony. When his father, Pharaoh Merenre, died suddenly, some whispered of poison, though no proof emerged. The 6-year-old prince found himself thrust onto the throne of the most powerful empire on earth. His mother, Queen Ankhesenamun, and Uncle Zhao initially served as regents, managing affairs of state, while the boy king learned his divine duties. But absolute power placed in the hands of a child would prove more poisonous than any assassin's blade. Early court records describe young Pepi as unnaturally precocious, displaying an intelligence that unnerved even experienced courtiers. Where other children played with toys, Pepi was fascinated by the mechanics of power, watching executions with rapt attention and questioning executioners about their methods with disturbing precision. His tutors, bound by religious duty to see their pharaoh as a living god, interpreted these dark interests as signs of divine wisdom beyond mortal comprehension. They had no idea they were nurturing a monster whose capacity for cruelty would eventually consume the kingdom itself. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small cruelties that grew larger as they went unchallenged by a court too terrified to correct their god king. At age 10, Pepi ordered a servant who had accidentally spilled wine during a banquet to stand in the desert sun until he collapsed. The punishment lasted 3 days and ended in death. But when courtiers dared suggest it was excessive, Pepi flew into such a rage that 2 more servants were executed simply for witnessing his anger. By age 12, he had established what he called his divine laboratory, a hidden complex within the palace where he conducted experiments in human endurance that would have impressed the most dedicated natural philosopher had they been applied to any other subject than torture. The methodical nature of Pepi's cruelty set him apart from other tyrants throughout history. This wasn't the random violence of a madman lashing out in rage, but calculated, organized suffering that required the cooperation of thousands of administrators, soldiers, and servants. He kept detailed records of his experiments, noting which methods produced the most prolonged agony, which victims showed the most interesting reactions, and which techniques could be refined for maximum psychological impact. His scribes were commanded to document every scream, every plea for mercy, every moment of a victim's breakdown, creating an encyclopedia of human suffering that filled entire libraries. The infamous honey torture that would become Pepi's signature method allegedly began during his 20th year of rule. A prisoner condemned for theft was accidentally covered in honey from an overturned jar while being transported to execution. As insects swarmed the man, Pepi witnessed the scene and became transfixed by the spectacle. He ordered the execution delayed, commanding his guards to observe and document how long the prisoner could endure the assault. That first victim survived 6 hours before succumbing to shock and blood loss. But for Pepi, those 6 hours had revealed a new frontier in suffering that combined nature is cruelty with human ingenuity for orchestrated torment. What followed was the systematic refinement of torture that demonstrated the terrifying capabilities of the Egyptian administrative state when directed toward evil ends. Pepi ordered experiments with different types of honey. Acacia honey attracted certain insects faster, while date honey's thickness provided longer lasting coverage. He cataloged which insects inflicted the most pain versus which caused the most visible damage. Fire ants were found ideal for sustained agony, their venom causing burning sensations that lasted for hours. Scarab beetles, sacred symbols of rebirth in Egyptian religion, were particularly prized for their ability to burrow into flesh while victims remained conscious. The infrastructure required to support these tortures grew exponentially, with entire farms converted from food production to beekeeping, and special units of soldiers trained not in warfare, but in the capture and cultivation of specific insect species. The economic drain was staggering. Historians estimate that at its peak, Pepi's torture system consumed approximately 30% of Egypt's total resources, more than the construction of the Great Pyramids had required. Specialized facilities had to be built, insect populations maintained, vast quantities of honey produced, and a massive administrative apparatus created to coordinate the systematic suffering of thousands. This economic burden, combined with the loss of productive population and the collapse of international trade as foreign nations refused to deal with Egypt, created a spiral of decline from which the Old Kingdom would never recover. The selection of victims followed a horrifyingly logical progression that revealed the true scope of Pepi's madness. Initially, condemned criminals were used, their sentences commuted from quick execution to prolonged torment. But as Pepi's appetite for spectacle grew, the definition of criminal expanded dramatically. Minor infractions that once merited fines now carried death sentences. When the supply of genuine criminals ran low, local governors were given quotas to fill, and families would wake to find their sons, fathers, and brothers taken in the night, accused of crimes they hadn't committed, destined for the honey chambers of Memphis. The ritual itself evolved into an elaborate ceremony that could last for days and demonstrated the sick artistry that Pepi brought to human suffering. Victims were first purified through starvation and forced bathing, their bodies prepared like offerings to the gods. The honey application became an art form, with specialized servants trained to create patterns and designs that would attract insects in specific sequences. Some victims were suspended in specially constructed frames that allowed insects access to every part of their body, while others were partially buried with only honey-covered portions exposed, prolonging their agony as different body parts were consumed in turn. Pepi's court became a grotesque theater where attendance at these spectacles was mandatory for nobles and visiting dignitaries. Those who showed disgust or sympathy risked becoming the next performance, and a complex etiquette developed around the tortures, applauding at appropriate moments, maintaining proper posture during victims' screams, and presenting an expression of religious reverence throughout. Foreign ambassadors reported being physically ill after these displays, with several kingdoms severing diplomatic ties rather than subject their representatives to such horrors. Egypt was becoming a pariah state, isolated from the civilized world by its rulers' insatiable appetite for cruelty. The psychological impact on Egyptian society was devastating and would persist for generations after Pepi's death. Parents deliberately disfigured their children, scarring faces or breaking limbs to make them undesirable for selection. Entire families fled to the desert, choosing the uncertainty of nomadic life over the risk of attracting royal attention. Suicide rates skyrocketed as many chose death on their own terms rather than risk the honey chambers. The traditional Egyptian belief in the afterlife became a source of desperate comfort for those who reasoned that any torment in this world would be balanced by eternal peace in the next. Religious authorities found themselves in an impossible position that highlights the dangerous fusion of absolute political power with divine authority. The pharaoh was not just a political leader, but a god incarnate, the living embodiment of Horus and son of Ra. To question his actions was not merely treason, but blasphemy of the highest order. Even the most devoted priests struggled to reconcile the suffering they witnessed with their understanding of divine justice. Some developed elaborate theological justifications arguing that victims were being purified for special roles in the afterlife, while others quietly began to question whether the gods had abandoned Egypt, or more terrifyingly, whether Pepi had somehow transcended even divine law. The resistance movements that emerged were quickly and brutally suppressed in ways that demonstrated Pepi's understanding of psychological warfare. In the city of Thebes, a group of priests attempted to declare Pepi spiritually corrupt and install a new pharaoh. Every member of the conspiracy was subjected to the honey torture, but with a special modification. Their families were forced to watch and then undergo the same fate. The message was clear. Opposition to Pepi meant not just death, but the complete annihilation of one's bloodline in the most agonizing way imaginable. This systematic elimination of entire family lines served both as punishment and warning, creating a terror so complete that even thinking rebellious thoughts became dangerous. The international response evolved from incredulity to horror to complete isolation, transforming Egypt from the dominant power of the ancient world into a pariah state. The kingdom of Kerma in Nubia sealed its borders completely, executing any Egyptian who attempted to cross. The city-states of the Levant formed defensive alliances, specifically aimed at preventing Egyptian expansion. Perhaps most tellingly, diplomatic records from Mesopotamia refer to Egypt not by its traditional names, but as the land of screams and the kingdom where the sun god has turned his face away. Trade routes that had connected Egypt to the wider world for millennia were abandoned, leaving the kingdom economically isolated just as it was morally quarantined. Even within the palace, the atmosphere grew increasingly surreal and nightmarish as Pepi's reign stretched into its seventh decade. Servants lived in constant terror, knowing that a misplaced word or gesture could result in selection for the next spectacle. The royal children, Pepi had numerous sons and daughters, through various wives and concubines, were raised in an environment where witnessing torture was as routine as attending religious ceremonies. Some grew up to become enthusiastic participants in their father's depravities, while others retreated into madness or carefully cultivated obscurity to avoid attention. Queen Ankhesenamun, Pepi's mother, who had initially served as regent, lived to see her son transform into a monster beyond her worst nightmares, spending her later years in self-imposed isolation within the palace and dying under suspicious circumstances that many believed to be suicide. As Pepi aged, entering his 70s and then 80s, an almost impossible age for the ancient world, his tortures became increasingly elaborate and bizarre. No longer content with a simple honey application, he demanded theatrical presentations where victims were dressed as gods and mythological figures. Their suffering meant to represent cosmic dramas. One particularly horrific spectacle involved 30 prisoners arranged to recreate the journey of Ra through the underworld, with each victim representing a different hour of the night, and their torments timed to last exactly that duration. The administrative structure supporting these atrocities had become so entrenched that it developed its own momentum, with subordinates continuing and even expanding the program when Pepi was too elderly to attend every session personally. The succession crisis that loomed as Pepi approached his 90th year added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish situation. Multiple sons and grandsons vied for position, each trying to prove their worthiness by exceeding their father's cruelty. Prince Meronre II, the eventual successor, distinguished himself by proposing that honey torture be incorporated into religious festivals, making it a sacred duty for all Egyptians to witness. The court had become a viper's nest where showing insufficient enthusiasm for torture was as dangerous as opposing it outright, and the competition among potential heirs drove the atrocities to even greater extremes. The final years of Pepi's reign saw the complete breakdown of central authority outside Memphis as regional governors declared independence rather than continue supporting the torture apparatus. Agricultural regions that had fed Egypt for millennia were abandoned as workers fled rather than risk conscription. The complex irrigation systems that had been the foundation of Egyptian prosperity fell into disrepair, and the gold mines of Nubia were deserted as laborers chose death in the desert over service to the mad Pharaoh. The once mighty Egyptian army, which had conquered vast territories and maintained peace throughout the empire, devolved into little more than a procurement force for Pepi's entertainments, leaving borders defenseless against increasingly bold incursions by nomadic tribes. When death finally came for Pepi II in 2184 BC, after 94 years of rule, it found a kingdom already dead in all but name. The succession struggle was brief and brutal, with various claimants fighting over the ruins of what had once been the world's greatest civilization. The Old Kingdom, which had endured for nearly a millennium and produced some of humanity's most magnificent achievements, collapsed entirely within a decade of Pepi's death, fragmenting into competing territories that would take centuries to reunify under the Middle Kingdom. The immediate aftermath saw an explosion of revenge, violence against anyone associated with the torture system, with former administrators hunted down and killed, often subjected to the same tortures they had overseen. The specialized facilities were burned, insect colonies destroyed, and anything associated with the honey tortures systematically obliterated. This violent purge, while understandable, destroyed much evidence that might have provided a fuller picture of the period's horrors, though enough survived to paint a clear image of systematic atrocity on an industrial scale. Archaeological excavations continue to yield disturbing discoveries that confirm the historical accounts long dismissed as exaggeration. Recently discovered complexes near Memphis appear to have been training facilities for torture administrators, complete with detailed instructional hieroglyphs and practice chambers. Thousands of ceramic vessels, specifically designed for insect storage, suggest operations of previously unimaginable scale. Advanced forensic analysis of remains has detected honey residues in burial sites and confirmed insect damage patterns consistent with historical descriptions. Modern science has vindicated ancient historians who documented horrors so extreme they seemed impossible to believe. The religious crisis created by Pepi's reign persisted for generations as Egyptians struggled with fundamental questions about divine authority and moral law. If the pharaoh was truly divine, how could a god commit such atrocities? If he wasn't divine, what did that mean for the entire structure of Egyptian religion and society? Some priests developed the doctrine of divine testing, arguing that Pepi had been a trial sent by the gods to test Egyptian faith, while others suggested that his extreme longevity was itself a curse that Egypt had to endure for unknown transgressions. The demographic impact can be seen in population statistics showing a dramatic decline during Pepi's rule, with census records suggesting Egypt's population fell by as much as 20% during the latter half of his reign. This represents not just direct victims of torture, but those who fled, those who died from famine caused by agricultural collapse, and children who were never born because of the disruption of normal family life. It would take centuries for Egypt to recover its pre-Pepi population levels, and the trauma inflicted on Egyptian society would echo through subsequent dynasties. Looking back across 4 millennia, Pepi II's reign serves as one of history's most extreme examples of how absolute power corrupts absolutely. The boy, who began as a legitimate ruler, concerned with Egypt, his prosperity transformed into something more terrifying than any traditional tyrant, a systematic destroyer of human dignity who used the machinery of civilization itself as an instrument of torture. His legacy was not just the collapse of the Old Kingdom, but a demonstration of how quickly even the most advanced societies can descend into barbarity when unchecked power meets unlimited cruelty. The story of Pepi II remains relevant today as a warning about the dangers of absolute authority and the ease with which normal people can be co-opted into systems of systematic cruelty. The thousands of administrators, soldiers, and servants who participated in his atrocities were not inherently evil, but ordinary individuals who found themselves trapped in a system where participation meant survival and resistance meant death. Their complicity enabled horrors that a single madman could never have accomplished alone, demonstrating how institutional structures designed to serve civilization can be perverted to destroy it. In the end, Pepi II's 94-year reign teaches us that the greatest threat to human dignity comes not from chaos or barbarism, but from organized, systematic evil that clothes itself in the robes of authority and divine mandate. His transformation from innocent child to history's most depraved monster shows how power without accountability inevitably corrupts, and how easily the instruments of civilization can be turned against the very people they were meant to protect. The Pharaoh, who ruled longer than any human in history, used every one of those years to demonstrate that when evil becomes institutional, even the mightiest civilizations can fall to their most savage impulses.